Hello, beautiful friends. I am Laurel, Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you rest, relax, and fall asleep, all while deepening in your connection with your beautiful team of angels who love you so. If we're meeting for the first time, I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. And I do this through one-on-one angel sessions, which are wonderful, one of my favorite things to support you with. And angel sessions are 60 minutes in length and take place over the phone. And as we gather together, I call in the angels and I draw some oracle cards for you. And then we have heartfelt, soul-inspired conversation, and you share with me your intention or the area of life where you would like to receive clarity or healing. And we go from there, and each session is unique. I never know where we're going to travel together, but the angels come through and I channel messages from the angels for you. And the intention is to help you deepen in your divine guidance. And if you're interested, I usually can schedule you in within a week or so. So feel free to reach out to me at illuminatingSouls.com, and I will be delighted to help you register for a session. I also offer soul mentoring, which provides for consistent support as you move through a time of growth or transition in life. And I also offer a variety of classes designed to inspire your spirit. So lots of ways we can connect. So I invite you to visit me at my website, illuminatingsouls.com. I also am active on Facebook. Illuminating Souls is my page. And I have a daily inspiration email blast that you can register for. And you will receive an inspiring message from me every weekday. So lots of things we can do together, but for now, the angels and I are here to help you rest. So whenever I begin each episode, I sit and ask the angels to bring forward inspiration or guidance that I can share with you, and I will reflect to you what is very present for me at this moment. My husband is an avid gardener. He loves growing things. He grows oak trees from acorns, and this time of year he is really tending to our vegetable garden. And I say ours, but truly it's his. I do nothing other than eat the vegetables. He is the one who tends the soil and nurtures the plants, is out there every day watering them and loving on them. And I am always mesmerized by this concept of growing plants from seeds. I know that it is the essence of the infrastructure of planet Earth, but it never ceases to mesmerize me that from a tomato seed, one tomato seed, we can grow these very prolific plants that keep us in tomatoes all season long. We have a number of different tomato plants that he has planted in the ground, and some of them are enormous right now, and they already have green tomatoes on them ready to ripen. Others are taking more time. And when I go out in the morning to visit the garden, the tomato plants are giving out this wonderful aroma that is so familiar to me from childhood, because my parents used to plant them as well. And I always think about how this reflects the ways that abundance can be made available to us here on earth. That from a single seed, we can get an enormous plant that will produce hundreds of tomatoes. Or that from a single seed of the apple, the part that we throw away, can come a tree. And if you have ever had an apple tree in your yard, you will know that apple trees always produce more apples than you can eat. And so you're giving away apples, and you're making apple sauce and apple butter and apple pie. From a single seed, we receive abundance. And if that is true in the plant kingdom, that is true for us as well. So I am always enchanted by the cycle of germination, of growth, of blossoming that happens in our garden. And I believe that that happens within us as well. For us, our experiences of germination and blossoming may not appear as physically in the world, but they appear in consciousness. They appear in a shift in how we hold for something within our hearts. It shows up with sparks of inspiration, new opportunities, that we are ever evolving beings. And when conditions are right, we blossom open. And so that's something I will sometimes focus on in my own life, is what is seeking to blossom open within me? And if I do not yet know, the question shifts to, how can I help cultivate my own sense of blossoming? What can I do to nurture that part of me that is seeking new horizons or new experiences? So this is wisdom from the garden today. It brings me a lot of joy to go out there in the morning and say hello to our plants and feel into the bounty they will be sharing with us in a few weeks. It also gives me profound gratitude for my husband, who goes out there and tends to it. He always says, "What do you want? I'll plant it for you." Very kind. And I will also say that I love the idea of being a gardener, but I have never truly enjoyed the act of it. I know some people love getting their hands in the dirt, and that's never quite been me, but that's okay. I live with a gardener, so it's all good. So here's to you blossoming open. Here's to you opening to the abundance that is here for you. And I'm going to call in the angels now, and they are already here to help amplify the frequency of love that is available to you right now. So I invite you to take a deep breath in and get comfortable in your body. You can cozy on in and snuggle on up if you're going to sleep. I know some of you listen to this during the day, but there's also the daytime version of cozying on up, whatever you need to do, letting your body grow heavy, that you have permission to rest, that you have done enough for this day, and you have permission to drift off to sleep. So take a nice breath in and just release. And I'll invite the angels in now. So beautiful angels on high, I invite you to join us here. I am so deeply grateful for your presence. I am so deeply grateful for the opportunity to come together in this moment in the waves of love that you are bringing forth. Angels, I ask that you infuse this broadcast with blessings of light for each of the beloveds who hear this message. I ask that you clear any fear, any worry, any sense of feeling burdened, and clear this up into the higher realms where they can be transformed in service for the highest good of all concerned. And angels, I ask that you assist each one of us in coming more deeply into alignment with our authentic self, coming into the brightness of our spirit, opening to the creativity that dwells within, helping us to connect with our own inner resourcefulness and the resources that are available that surround us. Angels, I ask that you bring forward sparks of inspiration that assist us in opening even more to the beauty and vibrancy of all that we are. I ask that you bring forward blessings of comfort and light, that we bathe in the streams of the healing waters that are available to us, that as we rest, we are restored, we are nourished, we are nurtured, and we are loved. And that our path ahead be paved with blessings, unexpected miracles, serendipity, and with many, many brighter tomorrows. And dear ones, in this moment, I thank God for the gift of you. I thank God for whatever confluence of events have happened to bring us here together in this moment. I declare this is a miracle that somehow I sit in front of my microphone in Vallejo, California, recording this message with the angels, and that it somehow finds you wherever you are and whenever you hear this message, that there is a wellspring of love that has been tucked into this broadcast for you, and that you are finding it right now in this moment. Your angels are with you, and I am feeling joy in my heart for this opportunity to love you, even if I do not know yet who you are. My soul knows and my heart knows, and I am deeply grateful for you. And I will say I am feeling the power of the energy moving through because I'm getting really hot. That often happens when I channel. I can be cold all morning, and then as soon as I start channeling, I get warm. I'm feeling the energy coming in for you. So all you have to do is receive. Even if you're not feeling it, it's okay. Not everyone feels energy the same way. Just know that it's here. Just know this love is here. And that your angels hold you in their hearts. Positive regard. They know the truth of you, the fullness of you, the wholeness of you. And they also know the parts of you that are feeling tender and challenged by life. It's okay. They've got you. The angels got your back. They're team you. So you take a beautiful breath in and give yourself permission to drift off. And while you do, your angels are going to stay with you. And I'm going to tell you a story. So I thought we could return to a wonderful book called Anne of Green Gables. And I am surprised to realize that I have not read this book since January. I think the last time I read it, I was on episode 12, and this is episode 56, so it's been a while. So Anne of Green Gables was written by Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I absolutely love this book. And I don't know how many of you have seen the series Anne with an E. I know here in the US it's available on Netflix. It's charming. And I will say that I saw the series before I read the book. And the book is about Anne, who is, Anne with an E, of course, who is an orphan. And there are an older brother and sister, Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, who have decided they're going to adopt an orphan because they can give the orphan a good home, and also because they'll be able to help them at their farm. Their intention is to adopt a little boy. But when Matthew gets to the train station to pick up their orphan, the orphan is Anne, a little girl. And he doesn't quite know what to do, so he brings her home. And Anne is desperate to stay with them. Anne is feisty and imaginative and has an incredible vocabulary and way of expressing herself. And so they said, okay, all right, you can stay. And Marilla, who's the more stern of the two, decides she's going to take it on to be the one who raises Anne, and she needs Matthew just to go along with things. Matthew is very sweet, very shy, and they're somewhere near their 60s. And they have a very nosy, bossy neighbor, Rachel Lynde. So the part of the story that we are in is still relatively at the beginning of the book. And Rachel Lynde has come over to meet Anne, and she is one of these women who just speaks her voice. And so she talks about how ugly Anne is and just says a lot of not nice things. And Anne just implodes, and she gives Mrs. Lynde a piece of her mind. She says she hates her, and she just says a lot of unflattering things about Mrs. Lynde, and Marilla is horrified, but also slightly amused, right? She won't admit that to anyone, but she's kind of amused, but horrified. And she sends Anne to her room. And this is where we pick up the story. Chapter 10, Anne's Apology. Marilla said nothing to Matthew about the affair that evening. But when Anne proved still refractory the next morning, an explanation had to be made to account for her absence from the breakfast table. Marilla told Matthew the whole story, taking pains to impress him with a due sense of the enormity of Anne's behavior. It's a good thing Rachel Lynde got a calling down. She'd a meddlesome old gossip, was Matthew's consolatory rejoinder. Matthew Cuthbert, I'm astonished at you. You know that Anne's behavior was dreadful, and yet you take her part. I suppose you'll also be saying next thing that she oughtn't to be punished at all. Well, no, not exactly, said Matthew uneasily. I reckon she ought to be punished a little. But don't be too hard on her, Marilla. Recollect, she hasn't ever had anyone to teach her right. You're going to give her something to eat, aren't you? When did you ever hear of me starving people into good behavior? Demanded Marilla indignantly. She'll have her meals regular, and I'll carry them up to her myself. But she'll stay up there until she's willing to apologize to Mrs. Lynde. And that's final, Matthew. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were very silent meals, for Anne still remained in her room. After each meal, Marilla carried a well-filled tray to the east gable and brought it down later, not noticeably depleted. Matthew eyed its latest ascent with a troubled eye. Had Anne eaten anything at all? When Marilla went out that evening to bring the cows back from the pasture, Matthew, who had been hanging about the barns and watching, slipped into the house with the air of a burglar and crept upstairs. As a general thing, Matthew gravitated between the kitchen and the little bedroom off the hall where he slept. Once in a while, he ventured uncomfortably into the parlor or sitting room when the minister came to tea, but he had never been upstairs in his own house since the spring he helped Marilla paper the spare bedroom, and that was 4 years ago. He tiptoed along the hall and stood for several minutes outside the door of the east gable before he summoned courage to tap on it with his fingers and then opened the door to peep in. Anne was sitting on the yellow chair by the window, gazing mournfully out into the garden. Very small and unhappy she looked, and Matthew's heart smote him. He softly closed the door and tiptoed over to her. Anne, he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. How are you making it, Anne? Anne smiled sadly. Pretty well. I imagine a good deal, and that helps to pass the time. Of course, it's rather lonesome, but then I may as well get used to that. Anne smiled again, bravely facing the long years of solitary imprisonment before her. Matthew recollected that he must say what he had come to say without loss of time, lest Marilla return prematurely. Well now, Anne, don't you think you'd better do it and have it over with, he whispered. It'll have to be done sooner or later, you know, for Marilla's a dreadful, determined woman. Dreadful, determined, Anne. Do it right off, I say, and have it over. Do you mean apologize to Mrs. Lynde? Yes, apologize. That's the very word, said Matthew eagerly. Just smooth it over, so to speak. That's what I was trying to get at. I suppose I could do it to oblige you, said Anne thoughtfully. It would be true enough to say I'm sorry, because I am sorry now. I wasn't a bit sorry last night. I was mad clear through, and I stayed mad all night. I know I did because I woke up 3 times, and I was just furious every time. But this morning it was over. I wasn't in a temper anymore, and it left a dreadful sort of goneness, too. I felt so ashamed of myself, but I just couldn't think of going and telling Mrs. Lynde so. It would be so humiliating. I made up my mind I'd stay shut up here forever rather than do that. But still, I'd do anything for you if if you really want me to." "Well, of course I do. It's terrible lonesome downstairs without you. Just go and smooth things over. That's a good girl." "Very well," said Anne resignedly. "I'll tell Marilla as soon as she comes in I've repented." That's right, Anne. But don't tell Marilla I said anything about it. She might think I was putting my oar in, and I promised not to do that." "Wild horses won't drag the secret from me," promised Anne solemnly. How would wild horses drag a secret from a person anyhow? But Matthew was gone, scared of his own success. He fled hastily to the remotest corner of the horse pasture, lest Marilla should suspect what he had been up to. Marilla herself, upon her return to the house, was agreeably surprised to hear a plaintive voice calling, "Marilla," over the banisters. "Well," she said, going into the hall. "I'm sorry I lost my temper and said rude things, and I'm willing to go and tell Mrs. Lynde so." "Very well." Marilla's crispness gave no sign of her relief. She had been wondering what under the canopy she should do if Anne did not give in. "I'll take you down after milking." Accordingly, after milking, behold Marilla and Anne walking down the lane, the former erect and triumphant, the latter drooping and dejected. But halfway down, Anne's dejection vanished as if by enchantment. She lifted her head and stepped lightly along, her eyes fixed on the sunset sky and on an air of subdued exhilaration about her. Marilla beheld the change disapprovingly. This was no meek penitent such as it behooved her to take into the presence of the offended Mrs. Lynde. "What are you thinking of, Anne?" she asked sharply. "I'm imagining out what I must say to Mrs. Lynde," answered Anne dreamily. This was satisfactory, or should have been so. But Marilla could not rid herself of the notion that something in her scheme of punishment was going askew. Anne had no business to look so rapt and radiant. Rapt and radiant Anne continued until they were in the very presence of Mrs. Lynde, who was sitting knitting by her kitchen window. Then the radiance vanished. Mournful penitence appeared on every feature. Before a word was spoken, Anne suddenly went down on her knees before the astonished Mrs. Rachel and held out her hands beseechingly. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry," she said with a quiver in her voice. "I could never express all my sorrow, no, not if I used up a whole dictionary. You must just imagine it. I behaved terribly to you, and I've disgraced the dear friends Matthew and Marilla, who have let me stay at Green Gables, although I'm not a boy. I am a dreadfully wicked and ungrateful girl, and I deserve to be punished and cast out by respectable people forever. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper because you told me the truth. It was the truth. Every word you said was true. My hair is red, and I'm freckled and skinny and ugly. What I said to you was true too, but I shouldn't have said it. Oh, Mrs. Lynde, please, please forgive me. If you refuse, it will be a lifelong sorrow on a poor little orphan girl, would you, even if she had a dreadful temper? Oh, I'm sure you wouldn't. Please say you forgive me, Mrs. Lynde." Anne clasped her hands together, bowed her head, and waited for the word of judgment. There was no mistaking her sincerity. It breathed in every tone of her voice. Both Marilla and Mrs. Lynde recognized its unmistakable ring, but the former understood in dismay that Anne was actually enjoying her valley of humiliation, was reveling in the thoroughness of her abasement. Where was the wholesome punishment upon which she, Marilla, had plumed herself? Anne had turned it into a species of positive pleasure. Good Mrs. Lynde, not being overburdened with perception, did not see this. She only perceived that Anne had made a very thorough apology, and all resentment vanished from her kindly, if somewhat officious heart. There, get up, child, she said heartily. Of course I forgive you. I guess I was a little too hard on you anyway, but I'm such an outspoken person. You just mustn't mind me, that's what. It can't be denied that your hair is terrible red, but I knew a girl once, went to school with her in fact, whose hair was every mite as red as yours, when she was young. But when she grew up, it darkened to a real handsome auburn. I wouldn't be a mite surprised if yours did too. Not a mite. Oh, Mrs. Lynde, Anne drew a long breath as she rose to her feet. You have given me hope. I shall always feel that you are a benefactor. Oh, I could endure anything if I only thought my hair would be a handsome auburn when I grew up. It would be so much easier to be good if one's hair was a handsome auburn, don't you think? And now may I go out into your garden and sit on that bench under the apple trees while you and Marilla are talking? There's so much more scope for imagination out there. Laws, yes, run along, child, and you can pick a bouquet of them white June lilies over in the corner if you like. As the door closed behind Anne, Mrs. Lynde got briskly up to light a lamp. She's a real odd little thing. Take this chair, Marilla. It's easier than the one you've got. I just keep that one for the hired boy to sit on. Yes, she certainly is an odd child, but there is something kind of talking about her after all. I don't feel so surprised at you and Matthew keeping her as I did, nor so sorry for you either. She may turn out all right. Of course, she has a queer way of expressing herself, a little too kind of forcible, you know. But she'll likely get over that now that she's come to live among civilized folks. And then her temper's pretty quick, I guess. But there's one comfort. A child that has a quick temper just blaze up and cool down, and never likely to be sly or deceitful. Preserve me from a sly child, that's what. On the whole, Marilla, I kind of like her. When Marilla went home, Anne came out of the fragrant twilight of the orchard with a sheaf of white narcissi in her hand. I apologized pretty well, didn't I? She said proudly as they went down the lane. I thought since I had to do it, I might as well do it thoroughly. You did it thoroughly, all right enough, was Marilla's comment. Marilla was dismayed at finding herself inclined to laugh over the recollection. She also had an uneasy feeling that she ought to scold Anne for apologizing so well, but then that was ridiculous. She compromised with her conscience by saying severely, I hope you won't have occasion to make many more such apologies. I hope you'll try to control your temper now, Anne. That wouldn't be so hard if people wouldn't twit me about my looks, said Anne with a sigh. I don't get cross about other things, but I am so tired about being twitted about my hair, and it just makes me boil right over. Do you suppose my hair will really be a handsome auburn when I grow up? You shouldn't think so much about your looks, Anne. I'm afraid you are a very vain little girl. How can I be vain when I know I'm homely, protested Anne. I love pretty things, and I hate to look in the glass and see something that isn't pretty. It makes me feel so sorrowful, just as I feel when I look at any ugly thing. I pity it because it isn't beautiful. Handsome is as handsome does, quoted Marilla. I've had that said to me before, but I have my doubts about it, remarked the skeptical Anne, sniffing at her narcissi. Oh, aren't these flowers sweet? It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give them to me. I have no hard feelings against Mrs. Lynde now. It gives you a lovely, comfortable feeling to apologize and be forgiven, doesn't it? Aren't the stars bright tonight? If you could live in a star, which one would you pick? I'd like that lovely, clear, big one away over there above that dark hill. And do hold your tongue, said Marilla, thoroughly worn out, trying to follow the gyrations of Anne's thoughts. Anne said no more until they turned into their own lane. A little gypsy wind came down it to meet them, laden with the spicy perfume of young dew-wet ferns. Far up in the shadows, a cheerful light gleamed out through the trees from the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne suddenly came close to Marilla and slipped her hand into the older woman's hard palm. It's lovely to be going home and know it's my home, she said. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. No place ever seemed like home. Oh, Marilla, I am so happy. I could pray right now and not find it a bit hard. Something warm and pleasant welled up in Marilla's heart at the touch of that thin little hand in her own. The throb of the maternity she had missed, perhaps. Its very unaccustomedness and sweetness disturbed her. She hastened to restore her sensations to their normal calm by inculcating a moral. If you'll be a good girl, you'll always be happy, Anne, and you should never find it hard to say your prayers. Saying one's prayers isn't exactly the same thing as praying, said Anne meditatively. But I'm going to imagine that I'm the wind that is blowing up there in those treetops. When I get tired of the trees, I'll imagine I'm gently waving down here in the ferns. And then I'll fly over to Mrs. Lynde's garden and set the flowers dancing. And then I'll go with one great swoop over the clover field. And then I'll blow over the lake of shining waters and ripple it all up into little sparkling waves. Oh, there's so much scope for imagination in a wind. So I'll not talk any more right now, Marilla. Thanks be to goodness for that, breathed Marilla in devout relief. Chapter 11. Anne's Impressions of Sunday School. Well, how do you like them? Said Marilla. Anne was standing in the gable room looking solemnly at 3 new dresses spread out on the bed. One was of a snuffy-colored gingham which Marilla had been tempted to buy from a peddler the preceding summer because it looked so serviceable. One was of black and white checkered sateen, which she had picked up at a bargain counter in the winter. And one was a stiff print of an ugly blue shade, which she had purchased that week at a Carmody store. She had made them up herself, and they were all made alike, plain skirts, folds tightly to plain waists with sleeves, as plain a waist and skirt and tight as sleeves could be. I'll imagine that I like them, said Anne soberly. I don't want you to imagine it, said Marilla, offended. Oh, I can see you don't like the dresses. What's the matter with them? Aren't they neat and clean and new? Yes. Then why don't you like them? Well, they're not pretty, said Anne reluctantly. Pretty, sniffed Marilla. I didn't trouble my head about getting pretty dresses for you. I don't believe in pampering vanity, Anne. I'll tell you that right off. Those dresses are good, sensible, serviceable dresses without any frills or furbelows about them, and they're all you'll get this summer. The brown gingham and the blue print will do you for school when you begin to go. The sateen is for church and Sunday school. I'll expect you to keep them neat and clean and not to tear them. I should think you'd be grateful to get most anything after those skimpy, wincey things you've been wearing. Oh, I am grateful, protested Anne. But I'd be ever so much more gratefuler if you'd just make one of them with puffed sleeves. Puffed sleeves are so fashionable now. It would give me such a thrill, Marilla, just to wear a dress with puffed sleeves. Well, you'll have to do without your thrill. I hadn't any material to waste on puffed sleeves. I think they are ridiculous-looking things anyhow. I prefer the plain, sensible ones. But I'd rather look ridiculous when everybody else does than plain and sensible all by myself, persisted Anne mournfully. Trust you for that. We'll hang those dresses carefully up in your closet and then sit down and learn the Sunday school lesson. I got a quarterly from Mr. Bell for you, and you'll go to Sunday school tomorrow, said Marilla, disappearing downstairs in high dudgeon. Anne clasped her hands and looked at the dresses. I did hope there would be a white one, with puffed sleeves, she whispered. I prayed for one, but I didn't much expect it on that account. I didn't suppose God would have time to bother about a little orphan girl's dress. I knew I'd just have to depend on Marilla for it. Well, fortunately, I can imagine that one of them is of a snow-white muslin, with lovely lace frills and 3 puffed sleeves. The next morning, warnings of a sick headache prevented Marilla from going to Sunday school with Anne. You'll have to go down and call for Mrs. Lynde, Anne, she said. She'll see that you get into the right class. Now mind you to behave yourself properly. Stay to preaching afterwards, and ask Mrs. Lynde to show you our pew. Here's a cent for collection. Don't stare at people and don't fidget. I shall expect you to tell me the text when you come home. Anne started off irreproachable, arrayed in the stiff black and white sateen, which, while decent as regards length and certainly not open to the charge of skimpiness, contrived to emphasize every corner and angle of her thin figure. Her hat was a little, flat, glossy new sailor, the extreme plainness of which had likewise much disappointed Anne, who had permitted herself secret visions of ribbon and flowers. The latter, however, were supplied before Anne reached the main road, for being confronted halfway down the lane with a golden frenzy of wind-stirred buttercups and a glory of wild roses. Anne promptly and liberally garlanded her hat with a heavy wreath of them. Whatever other people might have thought of the result, it satisfied Anne, and she tripped gaily down the road, holding her ruddy head with its decoration of pink and yellow very proudly. When she had reached Mrs. Lynde's house, she found that lady gone. Nothing daunted, Anne proceeded onward to the church alone. In the porch she found a crowd of little girls, all more or less gaily attired in whites and blues and pinks, and all staring with curious eyes at the stranger in their midst, with her extraordinary head adornment. Avonlea little girls had already heard queer stories about Anne. Mrs. Lynde said she had an awful temper. Jerry, the hired boy at Green Gables, said she talked all the time to herself, or to the trees and flowers like a crazy girl. They looked at her and whispered to each other behind their quarterlies. Nobody made any friendly advances then or later on when the opening exercises were over, and Anne found herself in Miss Rogerson's class. Miss Rogerson was a middle-aged lady who had taught a Sunday school class for 20 years. Her method of teaching was to ask the printed questions from the quarterly and look sternly over its edge at the particular little girl she thought ought to answer the question. She looked very often at Anne, and Anne, thanks to Marilla's drilling, answered promptly. But it may be questioned if she understood very much about either question or answer. She did not think she liked Mrs. Rogerson, and she felt very miserable. Every other little girl in the class had puffed sleeves. Anne felt life was really not worth living without puffed sleeves. "Well, how did you like Sunday school?" Marilla asked when Anne came home. Her wreath having faded, Anne had discarded it in the lane, so Marilla was spared the knowledge of that for a time. "I didn't like it a bit. It was horrid." "Anne Shirley," said Marilla rebukingly. Anne sat down on the rocker with a long sigh, kissed one of Bonnie's leaves, and waved her hand to a blossoming fuchsia. "They might have been lonesome while I was away," she explained. "And now about the Sunday school. I behaved well, just as you told me. Mrs. Lynde was gone, but I went right on myself. I went into the church with a lot of other little girls, and I sat in the corner of a pew by the window while opening exercises went on." Mr. Bell made an awfully long prayer. I would have been dreadfully tired before he got through if I hadn't been sitting by that window. But it looked right out on the lake of shining waters, so I just gazed at that and imagined all sorts of splendid things. "You shouldn't have done anything of the sort. You should have listened to Mr. Bell." "But he wasn't talking to me," protested Anne. "He was talking to God, and he didn't seem to be very much interested in it either. I think he thought God was too far off, though. There was a long row of white birches hanging over the lake, and the sunshine fell down through them, way, way down, deep into the water. Oh, Marilla, it was like a beautiful dream. It gave me a thrill. And I just said, 'Thank you for it, God,' 2 or 3 times. Not out loud, I hope," said Marilla anxiously. "Oh, no, just under my breath." Well, Mr. Bell did get through at last, and they told me to go into the classroom with Miss Rogerson's class. There were 9 other girls in it. They all had puffed sleeves. I tried to imagine mine were puffed too, but I couldn't. Why couldn't I? It was as easy as could be to imagine they were puffed when I was all alone in the east gable, but it was awfully hard there among the others who had really, truly puffs. "You shouldn't have been thinking about your sleeves in Sunday school. You should have been attending to the lesson. I hope you knew it." "Oh, yes, and I answered a lot of questions. Miss Rogerson asked ever so many. I don't think it was fair for her to do all the asking. There were lots I wanted to ask her, but I didn't like to because I didn't think she was a kindred spirit." Then all the other little girls recited a paraphrase. She asked me if I knew any. I told her I didn't, but I could recite "The Dog at His Master's Grave" if she liked. That's in the 3rd Royal Reader. It isn't truly religious piece of poetry, but it's so sad and melancholy that it might as well be. She said it wouldn't do, and she told me to learn the 19th paraphrase for next Sunday. I read it over in church afterwards, and it's splendid. There are 2 lines in particular that just thrilled me. "Quick as the slaughtered squadrons fell in Midian's evil day." I don't know what squadrons means, nor Midian either, but it sounds so tragical, and I can hardly wait until next Sunday to recite it. I'll practice it all the week. After Sunday school, I asked Miss Rogerson, because Mrs. Lynde was too far away, to show me your pew. I sat just as still as I could, and the text was Revelation's 3rd chapter, 2nd and 3rd verses. It was a very long text. If I was a minister, I'd pick the short, snappy ones. The sermon was awfully long, too. I suppose the minister had to match it to the text. I didn't think he was a bit interesting. The trouble with him seems to be that he hasn't had enough imagination. I didn't listen to him very much. I just let my thoughts run, and I thought of the most surprising things. Marilla felt helplessly that all this should be sternly reproved, but she was hampered by the undeniable fact that some of the things Anne had said, especially about the minister's sermons and Mr. Bell's prayers, were what she herself had really thought deep down in her heart for years, but had never given expression to. It almost seemed to her that those secret, unuttered, critical thoughts had suddenly taken visible and accusing shape and form in the person of this outspoken morsel of neglected humanity. And we'll read into a little bit of chapter 12, A Solemn Vow and Promise. It was not until the next Friday that Marilla heard the story of the flower-wreathed hat. She came home from Mrs. Lynde's and called Anne to account. Anne, Mrs. Rachel said you went into church last Sunday with your hat rigged out ridiculous with roses and buttercups. What on earth put you up to such a caper? A pretty-looking object you must have been. Oh, I know, pink and yellow aren't becoming to me, began Anne. Becoming? Fiddlesticks! It was putting flowers on your hat at all, no matter what color they were, that was ridiculous. You are the most aggravating child. I don't see why it's any more ridiculous to wear flowers on your hat than on your dress, protested Anne. Lots of little girls there had bouquets pinned on their dresses. What's the difference? Marilla was not to be drawn from the safe concrete into dubious paths of abstract. Don't answer me back like that, Anne. It was very silly of you to do such a thing. Never let me catch you at such a trick again. Mrs. Rachel said she thought she would sink through the floor when she saw you come in all rigged out like that. She couldn't get near enough to tell you to take them off until it was too late. She says people talked about it like something dreadful. Of course they would think I had no better sense than to let you go decked out like that. Oh, I'm so sorry, said Anne, tears welling into her eyes. I never thought you'd mind. The roses and buttercups were so sweet and pretty. I thought they'd look lovely on my hat. Lots of the little girls had artificial flowers on their hats. I'm afraid I'm going to be a dreadful trial to you. Maybe you'd better send me back to the asylum. That would be terrible. I don't think I could endure it. Most likely I would go into consumption. I'm so thin as it is, you see. But that would be better than being a trial to you. Nonsense, said Marilla, vexed at herself for having made the child cry. I don't want to send you back to the asylum, I'm sure. All I want is that you should behave like other little girls and not make yourself ridiculous. Don't cry anymore. I've got some news for you. Diana Barry came home this afternoon. I'm going up to see if I can borrow a skirt pattern from Mrs. Barry, and if you like, you can come with me and get acquainted with Diana. Anne rose to her feet with clasped hands, the tears still glistening on her cheeks. The dish towel she had been hemming slipped unheeded to the floor. Oh, Marilla, I'm frightened. Now that it has come down to it, I'm actually frightened. What if she shouldn't like me? It would be the most tragical disappointment of my life. Now, don't get into a fluster, and I do wish you wouldn't use such long words. It sounds so funny in a little girl. I guess Diana will like you well enough. It's her mother you've got to reckon with. If she doesn't like you, it won't matter how much Diana does. If she has heard about your outburst to Mrs. Lynde and going to church with buttercups round your hat, I don't know what she'll think of you. You must be polite and well-behaved, and don't make any of your startling speeches for pity's sake if the child isn't actually trembling. Anne was trembling. Her face was pale and tense. Oh, Marilla, you'd be excited too if you were going to meet a little girl you hoped to be your bosom friend and whose mother mightn't like you, she said as she hastened to get her hat. And so we're going to stop here. And in our next episode, we're going to pick up with the meeting of Diana and Anne. I just love this book, and I love the writing and the vocabulary, and I love little Anne's spirit. And I hope you're enjoying it too. I really hope you're asleep by now, and if you're not, I invite you to queue up another episode and we'll keep you company. But for now, I wish you sweet dreams. I wish you goodness and light, and I am deeply grateful for the gift of you. So thank you. Be well, and we'll talk again soon.